Yeah, go ahead, Maggie, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for spending some time with us to learn about brownfields and the road to redevelopment. This afternoon's session is being presented by the National Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities programs at Kansas State University, the Center for Creative Land Recycling, and the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Just a quick reminder that those of you participating in the session are eligible for 1 1/4 AICP CM credits. And you can log on to the website to learn more information about that. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to quickly go over what we're going to be talking about over the next hour and 25 minutes. I'm going to introduce the presenters for today, as well as kind of cover a little bit of basics about the TAB program, who we are, what we do. I'm going to go over a Brownfields redevelopment recap, and then throughout that recap, talk about or highlight some areas where TAB may be able to assist. And then we're going to hear about funding sources and financing options, and then as well as how to build resiliency into your redevelopment planning. Next slide. Our speakers for today are myself. My name is Maggie Eggbarts. I'm with the Kansas State University Technical Assistance to Brownfields program. I assist communities in US EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8 with pretty much any of their brownfields, reuse, redevelopment struggles, questions, concerns. I have over 16 years of experience in the environmental world, and about half of that has been on the brownfield side of things. I am joined today by Mary Hashem and Dr. Colette Sanatasari. Mary Hashem is the president of Adapta, a woman-owned small business serving local governments and nonprofits at the intersection of economic development, planning, and brownfields revitalization. Mary wears many hats. She also serves as one of our TAB partners, as well as the board chair for the Center Creative Land Recycling. And she also is a principal with RE Solutions, a brownfields acquisition and development company. Dr. Sanatasari is the executive director of the New Jersey Institute of Technology's TAB program. She has over 35 years of experience in environmental, infrastructure, land use, and community revitalization planning. She's an expert in planning and design of sustainable and resilient communities and properties. So she will be giving our final talk today about building resilience into your brownfields redevelopment. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Next slide. So what is TAB? Well, TAB stands for Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities. We are a nationally funded program through the US EPA. And so what that does is it allows us to offer all of our services to communities and tribes for free. I mentioned there are 3 TAB providers that cover areas all across the US. Kansas State University TAB program, our focus is mainly on the core of the US, US EPA regions 5, 6, 7, and 8, so those states that are highlighted in purple. The Center for Creative Land Recycling, or CCLAR, assists communities in regions 2, 9, 10, as well as Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. Those states are highlighted in green there on the map. And then the New Jersey Institute of Technology, or NJIT, assists communities in the states that are highlighted there in red in US EPA regions 1, 3, and 4. Again, we can provide assistance to community and tribes. We really tailor our services, or we like to tailor them to fit really the needs of the communities. And our services go across the board, anywhere from just starting out in that planning phase all the way through the redevelopment piece. Next slide. We also have what we call the Tribal TAB program, which just allows us to offer assistance to all tribal communities all across the 50 US. And we, when I say we, Kansas State, CCLAR, and NJIT, all 3 of the TAB programs work together to provide that assistance to our tribal communities. Next slide. So here's just a list of some of the services that the TAB programs are able to provide. I'm not going to really read this. You can see it, you can view it. These slides will be available for future viewing. But just know that it can vary. It can vary on what you need in your community or what you need as a local municipality. And we really don't like to say no. So sometimes it's just about getting creative. And then as I go throughout my presentation and kind of recap the Brownfields redevelopment process, I will highlight some key areas that TAB may be able to help in that regard. Next slide. So I think most of us that are in the room participating in this session, we've all seen this definition before, this legal, very wordy definition of a brownfield site. You know, it's a real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Brownfields may look different in different communities. One of the things with brownfields, there's a lot of good resources out there to go at about addressing these properties, as you will hear later from my colleagues, but it's not a one size fits all. You know, urban communities may be struggling with different sites and have different needs and brownfield challenges that look quite different than small rural communities. Next. You know, typically for smaller rural communities, their brownfield sites and challenges look a lot different. You know, their sites are more gas stations, those, you know, abandoned agricultural type buildings, old schools that have just been left vacant and that's set on the edge of town, or sometimes even out in the middle of nowhere. The economies in smaller communities are different. You know, you have that whole migration of youth out of the rural settings to metropolitan areas. You have the increase in aging population. So your needs for senior housing maybe, you know, maybe that's the need for your community. Next slide. You know, but whether you're big or small, brownfields are simply properties with possible environmental issues that are limiting the use of a site. One thing to keep in mind when we're talking about brownfields is that not all contaminated sites are brownfield and not all brownfield sites are contaminated. That's why we had the passage of the federal brownfields law in 2002. It just provides a process and even some funding, as you'll hear about later, to address these type of properties, these properties that are underutilized and not reused to their fullest potential. Oftentimes it is a perception that's just hindering the redevelopment or reuse. Well, go ahead and remove that stigma. Complete your environmental due diligence. Once that environmental assessment has been done, if contamination is discovered, there are resources out there that can assist you with the cleanup, as well as even developing an adaptive reuse strategy for the property. And Mary's going to touch on that a little later. While brownfield properties may pose challenges, they also provide opportunities. So definitely don't overlook these type of sites in your planning and revitalization process for your community. And TAB's here to help. We offer assistance throughout the brownfields journey, and I will touch on that as we go forward. Next slide. So I like to think of the brownfields redevelopment process into kind of 3 categories, and then with each of those categories, there's several steps along the way. Because really that's all this is. We're just taking steps to make improvements in a community. Next slide. One of the first steps in the brownfields redevelopment planning process is identifying sites in your community that have a potential for reuse or redevelopment. If you don't know where to get started with an inventory or even thinking about sites to look at, this is definitely an area that TAB can help. We can come visit a community. We can pick up the phone and have a phone conversation and just talk about a strategy or even come up with an outline for how you go about making an inventory of potential sites. And notice the keyword potential. It can be any site within your community that's not being used to its fullest potential. Then once you have your list, you can actually begin to prioritize that list by considering, you know, red flags and the real reason for why a site isn't being used the way that it should be used. It's also important to consider where a site is actually located and whether or not that site and the redevelopment of that site aligns and supports community goals. You know, whether you are just getting started or if you have an established inventory and you're looking for a way to keep and maintain your information, the National TAB program offers an online tool called the Brownfields Inventory Tool, where you can keep track and store all of your brownfields information. Next slide. The Brownfields Inventory Tool, like I mentioned, is an online data management tool. You can put in all your information regarding your brownfield or even other sites. You can put in site details as the sites go from assessment through cleanup to redevelopment. You can track and put information in there for that. A bit allows you to upload photos and documents and attach those documents to a specific site. You can also use the information within BIT to generate maps. We recently added a new feature to our BIT mapping tool, which will allow you to export files or generate a link that you can then add to, say, your own government's website and can directly link back into that information that you have stored in BIT. We have a mobile app that allows you to have kind of BIT on the go. So if you're out in the field or you're out doing drive-bys and you're looking for sites and you want a way to be able to store site addresses, locations, and we have a BIT mobile for that, BIT mobile app. And then let's say once you get back into your office and you have good Wi-Fi, you can then update and upload that information into the online database. Next slide. Another key step in the brownfields planning process that we like to think about and talk about is just really being engaged with the community. And I would say this is probably one of the most important pieces to the brownfields redevelopment process. Community engagement it's a two-way street. It's a way to share information as well as gather information and input from the public. It's also a way to get conversations going with other people in the community. Community members often will talk amongst themselves, and then they can start to see where their synergies align. It's also a really good way to develop the much needed partnerships to make brownfields redevelopment a success. You know, open public involvement can sometimes be scary, and there's all different mechanisms now for trying to engage the public, whether you can meet in person or virtually. Some people aren't quite sure where to get started, and that is another area where TAB can help. We can help identify maybe some key stakeholder groups in your community and help get that conversation started. You know, stakeholders are often a good way to start that community engagement because they represent various groups within the larger community. They can bring the needs and wants of that community to the table and then take information back to the groups they represent. Understanding stakeholder needs, having their support, having their input for redevelopment efforts really go a long way to being successful in planning and implementation of your projects. Next slide. In addition to helping maybe identify and facilitate those stakeholder conversations, TAB can also assist with a wide variety of community engagement activities when you're ready to go to the public at large. We can put on reuse visioning type group exercises. We can start maybe with an online survey. Just anything to get that conversation started with the general public. Next slide. Another one of the reasons why community engagement can be really important is it can really just help you set your redevelopment goals. Or even if you already have some vision for site or say a corridor or a region, but you're looking to refine those goals because maybe they're a little bit outdated. You can use the input that you've gotten from your stakeholders and your public to refine those goals and start putting some of those ideas and concepts down on paper. Some areas where TAB can offer assistance in this regard, you know, again, I mentioned we can help facilitate meetings to come up with a strategic plan. We could do reuse visioning exercises. We have a wide network and range of partners among the 3 different TAB programs. So we're able to offer, you know, economic feasibility and sustainability analysis. And we can just put on educational workshops if it's about coming out to a very specific localized region, area, or community to talk about brownfields, what that is, what that means. We can do that. Next slide. This is just kind of an example of one of the reuse visioning exercises we did and how we utilize partners. It started in August of 2018 with a public meeting, the photo up there in the upper left-hand corner. They broke out into small group exercises. They were working on a former contaminated tire site that was next to wetlands, and they didn't even know where to get started. You know, what did they want this to look like, to know what they needed to clean up. how they needed to clean it up. We partnered with the South Dakota State University Landscape Architecture Program and incorporated students. So the students took the results from that August public meeting and they generated some initial reuse design concepts based on that public input. The village was presented with those draft designs that the students generated. They too provided feedback, went back to the students, and then what you see there on the right-hand side of your screen was a final reuse concept that was generated for the site based on all that input and public feedback. And so now the village of East Troy, Wisconsin has something tangible. They can see it, they can visualize it, they can use it to have further conversations in the community or even secure the necessary funding that they need for redevelopment. Environmental assessments is another big piece of the Brownfields redevelopment journey. Now we at TAB, we don't do any sampling. We don't go out there and install the monitoring wells or collect the soil borings, but we can, there's lots of environmental consultants out there. We can help you find and evaluate environmental consultants for your project. We can review technical documents and kind of just help explain in more maybe layman's terms what some of that information means. Let's say you have an existing report out there and you're not sure what it means or where to go from here. We can help you with that. We can help with those conversations and try to get you going and on the right track. Next. And then the redevelopment phase is usually kind of towards the end, the final phase of the Brownfields redevelopment process. It's what I say, it's where the magic gets to start to happen. You get to start pulling in all those public involvement input. You get to bring in all your partners and really start to see taking a site that was abandoned, vacant, or underutilized. You go through the process of assessing and cleanup, and then now you get to actually start that redevelopment and realize what that site can actually become. Some of the areas that TAB can assist in this regard, again, we tap into a lot of our different network of partners that cover a wide variety of experience and expertise. One of our partners, Sustainable Strategies, puts on these or completes these resources roadmaps, which is a document that essentially just outlines, based on your goals, your needs for your community, some available resources that are out there that you can tap into and apply for to help you along that way. We can also perform some feasibility study or small scale market analysis. And we have also facilitated resource roundtables. And what resource roundtables are is we bring a bunch of players to the table to just start having a conversation. That could be lenders, developers such as Mary, community key stakeholders, private property owners, just to start having the conversations about what is needed to take the next steps to meet your redevelopment goals for particular properties. Next slide. Okay, next slide, sorry. And then I just touched on a few of our resources. We have a bunch of other information out there that's available for our TAB programs. I encourage you, based on which region you're located in or which state you're located in, to look at the K-State, the CCLAIR, and the NJIT web pages and just get a feel for some of the services we have to offer. Next slide. We really don't have a formal application process for our services. It's a matter of sending an email or picking up the phone and contacting any of us. We can have a conversation, see where your needs are, see if it's a good fit for the TAB program, and then we can get started and go to work. So that's a very quick, brief overview of TAB and the Brownfields redevelopment process. And now I'm going to hand it off to one of our TAB partners, Mary Hashem, to talk about some of those funding sources and financing options for your Brownfields project. Take it away, Mary.
All right, thank you, Maggie. That's a great introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you. I was asked to talk about funding sources and financing options for brownfield sites. I want to note this is a 202 level conversation. So I was told that, the folks I'm talking to really have a lot of experience and are down in the trenches on this work and don't need an intro course. So we're going to step it up a little bit. I will note that as we go through the presentation here on the financing side, if you have questions or I use a term you're not familiar with, please type a question into the chat feature. The organizers will be watching that and can interrupt or give me a little heads up that I need to go back and clarify something. I don't want to leave anyone behind. There will be a Q&A session at the end of our presentation, so if there are broader picture questions, we can address them then. But if I use a term or a concept that you're just not familiar with, go ahead and type that answer, and we'll type that question. We'll get you an answer. So I'm going to be talking about basically how to think about financing a brownfield deal, and that has a lot of different components to it. Is a bigger picture structuring of your financing and funding sources. One of the concepts is finding the right money at the right time, and I'll explain what that means. And then how do you identify the sources of that money and bring that money to bear when you need it. Next slide, please. So in thinking about financing a brownfield deal, there's some overarching sort of financial structuring questions that you have to keep in mind and answer for your own project. This is going to be from the perspective of a developer, because I'm assuming we're talking to development professionals here, public or private sector, or at that interface of public and private partnerships. And so what you're trying to do is bring resources to bear on identifying, investigating, and ultimately redeveloping a brownfield site. So the first thing you need to think about is debt versus equity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that in this presentation because it is a higher level presentation. I'm going to assume that everyone understands the different flavors of money, the different colors of money, if you will, here. Debt being something that has to be repaid. Equity is basically an at-risk investment in the project itself. And the different sources of both debt and equity we'll talk about further on. I do want to leave you with the note that probably you are aware of. Debt is very difficult to come by for brownfield sites. Most traditional sources of debt, even in the private equity, private debt fund world, doesn't like to loan on contaminated property. So about the only debt instrument for brownfields is the EPA Brownfield Revolving Loan Fund program. And if you don't have one of those in your region or your area, I would strongly encourage you to look into that and consider an application to EPA in the next round for a grant for a revolving loan fund program. It can be a wonderful seed program to kick off a real brownfield program and initiative. Next slide, please. So one of the fundamental concepts as you're looking at structuring financing for a brownfield deal, or really any real estate deal, is you want to think about sources and uses. Where's your money coming from and how is it going to be used? Very often, the source of the money will come with some handcuffs on it. There will be ties, strings attached that say you can use this money for A, but not for B. So very often EPA, if you get a brownfield assessment grant, you can use it for assessment, but not cleanup, unless you get a multi-action fund, the MAT grants that have assessment and cleanup funds in them. But very often you may get money that has to be used for a particular thing. So you want to make sure there's a crosswalk here as you're outlining your sources and your uses to match up that the money that's coming from a particular place is going to an appropriate, acceptable use. And the main sources of funding, again, just break down at this most simple level into debt and equity. But equity and debt both come in a lot of different flavors. The main source of equity is going to be that development equity and that the developer equity, and that may even be a CDC or a development organization, still qualifies as developer equity. There's a certain amount of your own funds that you have to put into preparing a site, either for acquisition or for development. And then again, debt on brownfields is very difficult to come by. Sometimes there can be public financing sources of debt. such as the EPA funds or some municipal bonds in special cases that will be allowed to be used on a brownfield site. Again, it's rare. If you can find it, it's great. These sites benefit from leverage, but often is hard to find. And the uses for the money is anything you could think of, from community outreach and planning all the way through the hard and soft development and construction costs. So the whole gamut of uses for that money. Again, and next slide, please. In preparing a sources and uses table, you want to make sure, again, that your sources and your uses are matching up. This is a simplified version of a sources and uses table for a project I was very close to and worked on for a number of years, the former Asarco Glow smelter in Denver and Adams County, Colorado. This gives you an idea of the kinds of things you're looking at, the funding sources, and whether it's, you know, a grant, which would be equity, developer equity, debt or grants, and then how that's used. So I would call your attention to the $10 million HUD 108 grant we received from Adams County. That had to go, if you notice on the right-hand column, the shaded overlot grading, on-site and off-site infrastructure. There's a one-to-one crosswalk there. That HUD 108 money had to go to on-site infrastructure and site preparation for development. So that was an easy one. The other ones get a little bit more complicated. But this is just, again, a simplified idea of how you want to set up a sources and uses table so that you're identifying the sources of your funds, the kinds of money it is, and then the project uses that those funds are going to go to. Next slide, please. The other concept I want to talk about is that of a capital stack. This is a little bit different from the sources and uses because it's not so much talking about where the money is coming from, but what that money is. And it's just a term that defines the different, what are called, you know, layers or tranches of funding that go into a real estate deal. This is typically shown as a picture. And when it's properly depicted, it also shows you the relative risk of the different sorts of money. So the bottom, next slide, please, let's take a look at it. The bottom of a stack, and this can be shown as a column or a triangle, or, you know, it can get interesting graphically, but fundamentally the bottom of the stack is the most secure debt. And as you move up, you get into more and more risky funds until at the very top you're looking at typically developer equity, which is entirely at-risk money invested in a deal. So the examples here of how capital stacks would look under different scenarios, the one on the far left is your home loan. So that's, you know, you're putting 80 or 90% of that purchase price of a home is going to be your first mortgage. You're putting 10, 20% of down payment or equity into the loan. And so this is what a capital stack would look like for a home loan. You've got a layer of equity, which is your money that's at risk in the event that housing prices go down. That's money that you would lose that would no longer be in the value of the home you just bought. And we've seen that happen in our economy. It's rare, but it does happen. And then beneath that is your primary first mortgage that is secured debt, very secure. It's based on the collateral is the home. You lose your equity, but in most cases that mortgage will be paid off. Maybe over time you've paid on your mortgage and you've developed some greater equity in the home, and that's the lighter blue at the top of the second column. And now you want to cash in some of that equity and take out a second mortgage, maybe for home improvement, maybe for a vacation or a wedding, whatever. So now you're going to layer in a second mortgage, and that's another debt considered junior debt to the senior secured first mortgage debt. It is a little more at risk in that this first mortgage is going to get paid off in the event of a sale or liquidation of the home before the second mortgage. And now you have shrunk your equity up to that smaller piece at the very top. In commercial real estate, there's often a few different layers, and this again is very simplified, but a few different layers of equity, sometimes a preferred equity from a capital investment partner, And there can be other forms of junior or what's called mezz debt, mezzanine debt, bridge loans. This could be a construction loan that comes in for a short period of time and then is taken out by senior debt at a certain point of stabilization of the project. Notice the real difference with a brownfield site. And this is something that I really want to leave you with here, is that a brownfield site, see how big that equity column is? Brownfields require a lot more equity, partly because debt isn't typically available, also because hopefully you're getting a lot of grant money and in-kind contributions that all go into that equity column. But that is the, just visually, I want to leave you with the thought that in forming your sources and uses, you're probably going to be looking at far more equity sources than you are debt sources and building a capital stack for a brownfield deal. Next slide, please. So we talked about the right money at the right time, and what does that mean exactly? As you're structuring the capital stack, you want to keep in mind how much money you're going to need, when you're going to need it, and what it's going to go to. So for instance, very early in a project, some of the things that Maggie talked about that TAB can help with and with other EPA programs can help with are things like community outreach and engagement, planning activities and assessment work. There are other EPA programs that I'll mention later that can go to actually doing some of the in-the-field work that the TAB money can't. These are grants. The value of that would go into your sources and uses as a grant, but it would have that string on it so that the money's coming in, or the value of the service is coming in, and it's going for a particular activity, be it community engagement or assessment. The later stages of a project are going to need larger dollars, and they're going to hopefully begin to be more debt money. And it's for things like cleanup, constructing infrastructure, and actually beginning construction on the redevelopment project. So this is where you need to look at that combination of debt and equity. Hopefully you're going to, at a minimum, construction loan, but sometimes also infrastructure. There may be some debt available from municipal sources or government sources for infrastructure funds. That's where you're looking to layer in the larger amounts of money that hopefully are more debt than equity. And the other thing with brownfields you have to think about is planning for the long-term care of the property. And this is like long-term O&M, operation and maintenance, whether it's monitoring, groundwater monitoring, vapor monitoring. Most brownfield sites, not all, but most brownfield sites are going to be closed to some sort of restricted use status. If your property is completely cleaned up to unrestricted residential standards, then you don't have to worry about this. But in any case where you are using a risk-based cleanup standard to close to commercial industrial standards, or you're going to build residential, but you're going to do it with some sort of engineering controls for vapor mitigation, any kind of long-term obligation or care for that project moving forward has got to be considered and planned for ahead of time. Sometimes what will happen in a commercial development is there'll be some sort of commercial owners group, like a homeowners association, an HOA in a residential scenario. You'll have an industrial owners association in, say, an industrial office park, and there will be fees assessed and put into a fund that the manager of the Industrial Property Owners Association goes to use that money toward maintaining insurance, conducting necessary groundwater monitoring, O&M on a vapor mitigation system, or that sort of thing. There are other ways to do it, depending on what the redevelopment property is like, but that's something you have to think about up front. Next slide, please. So these are just some examples of funding sources and financing options. It runs the gamut. I'm assuming folks are familiar with bonding and TIF and the various kinds of municipal sources of funding that are available for any redevelopment project, not just brownfields. The particular ones I want to call out is this in-kind support, EPA, TBA assistance, and TAB support. You are, as municipal or nonprofit entities, absolutely eligible for both of these and should take advantage of them. Next slide, please. Some of the non-EPA sources of funding are things like the HUD programs, various tax credit programs. USDA has a great grant program that can be used on brownfields, particularly rural brownfields. EDA has a number of economic development kinds of grants. There are a lot of federal non-EPA sources of funding that can be brought to bear on brownfields, and you shouldn't overlook these. Sustainable Strategies does a really great job with their resource roadmap in identifying some of these other federal funding programs that are non-EPA funding that are often overlooked on brownfields. Next slide, please. So here are a couple of publications that you might want to take a look at. They're all available on EPA's website. Their Federal Programs Guide has a laundry list of all those federal agencies that provide funding to brownfields. You've heard a lot from Maggie's presentation about technical assistance to brownfield communities, the TAB program. I would also like to note that in addition to the community outreach and the brownfields inventory kinds of things, TAB can also help with very basic real estate planning functions. We have the ability through TAB to do market studies or to do very simple land planning exercises or real estate feasibility analyses or pro forma, simple back of the envelope pro forma to evaluate different redevelopment scenarios. There's a lot of assistance available through TAB. What TAB doesn't do is that on the ground sampling analysis that most environmental consultants do. That's actually available through another EPA program called TBA. Instead of TAB, it's TBA. It's targeted brownfield assistance. And that is where an EPA contractor can direct their contractor to go actually do environmental work at your site. And that you would access that by talking to the brownfields folks at your EPA regional headquarters. So if you don't know where your EPA regional brownfields people are, you should absolutely get to know them because there are other EPA programs in addition to TAB that can help, particularly on the upfront side of this. That was a very, very fast overview of financing on brownfields. I'm going to turn it over to Colette now, but we'll be happy to take any questions at the end of our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. So I'm Colette Santasiri. I'm the Executive Director of the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfields Communities Program, otherwise known as NJIT TAB. Next slide. So we hear a lot about how communities need to be more resilient. So what does that really mean? It means that communities need to be able to respond to and recover from adversity, whether that adversity is caused by the negative impacts of climate change and sea level rise, or economic disinvestment, or social inequity. I view brownfield sites as opportunities for economic growth, for social equity, for land uses that meet communities' needs, such as housing and recreation, schools, healthcare facilities, urban agriculture, just to name a few. I also view brownfields, those vacant or underutilized former industrial and commercial properties, as a key ingredient to helping make communities more resilient. So to make this case, I've selected several examples of how communities are becoming more resilient with the help of redeveloped brownfield sites. Next slide, please. So my first example is one of coastal resilience. It is South Wilmington Wetlands Park. This park is adjacent to the Southbridge neighborhood in Wilmington, Delaware. This neighborhood, with a population of about 2,000 people, sits on the low-lying peninsula along the Christina River. Its row homes are 3 to 4 feet above sea level, but during high tide, the Christina River is 5 feet above sea level. The flood control system designed to protect the community is aging and often fails, leaving the neighborhood, streets and basements flooded, as you can see, on a regular basis. In addition, rain events overload the combined sewer system. Next slide. To provide flood relief, the city is constructing the 30-acre South Wilmington Wetlands Park. The location of the park is on one of the largest brownfield sites in the city. Contaminated soil has been removed and the quality of the wetlands is being restored. Next slide. The end result will be a new park that acts as a natural stormwater storage area. It will include a functional freshwater wetland and wildlife habitat. It will also serve as new open space for community residents, providing passive recreational opportunities. Next slide. The second example demonstrates community resilience to power outages. For 40 years, the 15-acre city landfill in Rutland, Vermont, accepted municipal solid waste. It closed in the 1980s and remained dormant for 30 years. In 2015, the landfill was repurposed into a renewable energy site. It is now home to the Stafford Hills Solar Farm, a 2.3 megawatt solar installation that operates as part of the main power grid. The reason I'm highlighting this project as an example of resilience is that the solar farm is also a microgrid, which means it can be separated from the main power grid and act autonomously during power outages. So in the event of a power outage, the Stafford Solar Hill Circuit can provide electricity to the town's emergency shelter. Next slide. My next two examples deal with a community's economic resilience. Sparta, Tennessee is home to about 5,000 people. In 2012, a lighting manufacturer that was a major employer in town closed, leaving 284 people unemployed. The 300,000 square foot property, which consists of 3 vacant buildings, was contaminated with PCBs and heavy metals. It was scheduled to be sold for salvage. At about this time, Jackson Kayak, an already established business, was looking to expand its operations. They manufacture recreational kayaks, paddle boards, and coolers. The company decided to invest more than $4 million to renovate the site. Next slide. By transforming this brownfield site, Jackson Kayak created over 250 new full-time jobs in Sparta. Next slide. For the next example of economic resilience, we go to Aurora, Colorado. In 1954, Robert Stanley, a former Navy test pilot in search of a new beginning for Stanley Aviation, completed a 22-acre campus that featured an impressive 100,000 square foot manufacturing facility in the heart of town. It thrived for 50 years and was the largest employer in town. But by 2009, it ceased operations. The contaminated site was remediated and became the Stanley Marketplace. Next slide. Which is home to 54 independently owned businesses, including restaurants, breweries, yoga studios, clothing stores, barbershops, hair salons, and a daycare center. In addition, this innovative marketplace also features a collaborative office space and an over 18,000 square foot event center, in addition to a 7-acre urban farm. As an anchor for the community, it has provided more than 500 new jobs. Next slide. My last two examples are of resilience to social inequity. Social inequity encompasses a lot of different issues. In my two examples, I'm focusing on food deserts. This area in Pawtucket, Rhode Island was once an industrial stronghold. And you can see in the picture on the right that says 2019, what it used to be, and the picture on the left, June 2020, what it looks like now. So this area suffered years of disinvestment and abandonment. The neighborhood became a food desert, which is defined as an area where residents' access to affordable, healthy food options, especially fresh fruit and vegetables, is restricted or non-existent due to the absence of grocery stores within convenient driving distance. So in this area, in the picture on the right, a 3.2-acre site in the neighborhood held the long vacant Eastern Wire Products mill site. Next slide. This site was cleaned up and has been transformed into Farm Fresh Rhode Island food hub. Farm Fresh Rhode Island's mission is to provide the community with nutritional outreach, financial incentives, and educational programs to increase accessibility and affordability of fresh local foods. Approximately half of the food hub's newly constructed 60,000 square foot building will house programs and operations, including a year-round farmers market. The remaining space will be leased to food and farm-related small businesses. The site also includes a half-acre of publicly accessible green space featuring sustainable native plantings. One of the programs run by Farm Fresh Rhode Island is Harvest Kitchen, a culinary job training program for youth ages 16 to 19 involved in the Rhode Island Department of Child, Youth, and Families. The Farm Fresh Rhode Island program has impacted the local community and economy by helping to rebuild and strengthen the regional food system while providing farm sustainability and food security and creating jobs. 284 new jobs were created during the construction and development phases of the redevelopment project. 117 new and retained jobs were created at the completion of the project. Farm Fresh Rhode Island projects that they will create an additional 168 jobs by the end of their 5 years. Next slide. My final example brings us to Montana. A 13,000 square foot industrial building once served as a freight transfer warehouse for over a half a century. In 2005, the North Missoula Community Development Corporation purchased the site to revitalize the North Side neighborhood, which was considered a food desert. Next slide. In 2011, the Burn Street Nutrition Center was opened. The site currently houses Plant Perks, a vegan cheese alternative manufacturer, and Burn Street Bistro, a shared use commercial kitchen and cafe, which brings locally sourced food and kitchen for hire to the neighborhood. The Burn Street Bistro space is available for rent to groups and individuals at no charge for neighborhood organizations and at a low affordable fee for nonprofit and private parties. Additionally, the Missoula Food Bank, the Boys and Girls Club, and North Missoula Development Corporation partnered to launch an afternoon program to serve free, nutritious meals to low-income children within the Burn Street Bistro space. Once a month, a free cooking class workshop is hosted by Burn Street Bistro. Real Meals is a participant-driven cooking and nutrition workshop series intended to help families gain skills and knowledge. Childcare is included, and participants are sent home with recipes and leftovers. While these are great examples of addressing a disruption and disruptions to communities that certainly need to be addressed, creating a resilient community is more than a single project. A community is a multifaceted, layered physical and social system, and to create a truly resilient community, all of the challenges that the community faces need to be identified and addressed, and adaptations to those challenges must be carefully constructed. It's a process, and because every community is different, there is no one-size-fits-all. Next slide. So narrowing down this discussion of building resilient communities to how you can use redeveloped brownfield sites as a tool, I jotted down a few tips. Again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach. Can't take out a book and follow the instructions. So here's some tips, some things you can think about as you're tackling your community and its need to be more resilient. So the first tip is you can't go it alone. So start by building your team. First, determine the purpose of that team and then identify the appropriate stakeholders. This slide gives you some examples. My advice is to keep the team under a dozen people or so. If it gets to be too many, it's difficult to get a lot of things done. Next slide. The second tip is to determine your community's vulnerabilities. whether that is rising sea levels, lack of healthcare facilities, lack of living wage jobs, just to name a few. The mixture of the team that I had just mentioned, the mixture of the members of that team is really important when determining the community's vulnerabilities. So for instance, if your team was solely comprised of economic development folks, they may not be aware of some of the social equity issues, but having a local environmental justice organization or a local clergy on the team, they can shed light on some of these issues. Similarly, a local university may have experts on climate change issues that can bring that perspective on the community's vulnerabilities. Your community may have more than one vulnerability. So while persistent flooding may be an obvious condition because everyone can see the water, other vulnerabilities may not be as obvious because their impacts are not as visible or not felt by the majority of the community. So you really need to identify what your community vulnerabilities are. Next slide. Another important step is to inventory your brownfield sites. Maggie mentioned this earlier in her presentation. Your town may have just one brownfield. It might have 20 or more. Learn all that you can about these sites. Who owns them? Has contamination been determined? Is there a plan to clean up the contamination? What's the current zoning? Are these sites located in designated redevelopment areas, and so on? Learn everything you can about the sites. And also then map the sites so you can see where they are in relation to other elements in your community. Is the brownfield site located along a waterway that floods? Is a brownfield site located within a section of town that has been identified as a healthcare desert? View your brownfield sites as assets and opportunities because they may be valuable tools in helping your community overcome those vulnerabilities that you have identified. Next slide, sorry. So the next tip is to match your brownfield sites to the vulnerabilities if possible. But don't just take a singular approach. For instance, if persistent flooding is an issue and you have multiple brownfield sites, you may want to create a green stormwater infrastructure network, such as, some brownfield sites are developed as rain gardens, but other brownfield sites, if they're larger swaths of land, can hold floodwaters, but also serve as recreational fields like soccer fields. Or perhaps economic investments are needed in your community. Look at the location of your brownfield sites and determine which sites would make the most sense for economic reuse. That goes back to the inventory and mapping of your brownfield sites and prioritizing those sites, as Maggie had also mentioned. You need to look at all that information that you collected. So for instance, some brownfield sites along transportation routes and of sufficient size and zoned accordingly for commercial reuse might be good for economic resilience activities. By taking a systems approach, you can market these brownfield sites for economic reuse. So be strategic in your planning and look beyond the single brownfield site. Next slide. While I have this tip as my last slide, it is by far the most important. Engage your community. Engage your community early and throughout the entire planning and implementation process. Maggie also mentioned this, and I cannot emphasize it enough. Engaging your community is your most important step. So community members are the ones that are affected by these economic, social, and environmental vulnerabilities and impacts. They are also the ones that will benefit from the interventions. They need to be part of their process. Their voice needs to be heard. Next slide. So for communities attempting to become more resilient, no matter whether that is coastal resilience, economic resilience, or resilience related to social inequity issues, look around your town. Find those former factories and mills, closed gas stations, and dumping grounds. They may just be the key ingredient to your ability to bounce back from adversity. The tab providers are here to help you with those efforts. If you are located in EPA regions 1, 3, or 4, please contact me and we can talk about how NJIT tab can help you. Thanks so much. I think I'm sending it back to Maggie.
Great, thank you, Mary and Colette. So now we have about a little over, well, we have about 15 minutes left in our session. So hopefully we can get some good question and answers dialogue going. I did notice a few questions that appeared to me via the chat function, so I will pose those now. The first question is for Mary. Mary, what's your experience with CPACE financing, and is it a good mechanism for brownfield development?
Helpful if I unmuted. We've not used CPACE financing on any of our deals to date, so I don't have direct experience with it. I think from what I know about it is that it absolutely could be used on brownfields. One of the things that we try to do on our projects is look at all kinds of sustainability features for our sites, and we do a lot of solar, a lot of electric vehicle charging stations, a lot of stormwater management in very sustainable ways. So I think, you know, I think that program is absolutely applicable to brownfields. It's not either limited to brownfields or any reason why it couldn't be used on them.
Great, thank you. And then here's a question that I think is probably for all of the tab providers. So I'll ask the question, answer it, and then yeah, Colette or Mary, you guys can fill in too. Is there a wait list for tab services, or is it openly available? And is any match required? I know for K-State tab, it's year round. There's not a set time you need to request, you know, your assistance now or before this time. It's ongoing as long as we have the funds available to do certain things. We may be limited on staffing capacity at some moments, just depending on what we already may be doing in communities or workshops, webinars, things like that. But it's, nope, you are free to contact us, you know, anytime throughout the year. On the financial side of things, there isn't a match required. Again, since we are a national funded program, we're an EPA grantee, we are able to provide the services we offer for free. And so it doesn't cost you anything to pick up the phone, have a chat with us, or send us an email, and we can see how it works. I would say the only wait list that we may have is, like currently right now, it's the EPA national call for brownfield grant applications that are due October 28th. And as part of our services, all of us tab providers offer free reviews and feedback of draft applications. And so we do kind of have, I guess, a deadline for that, just to, we get a lot of requests, as well as we want to make sure that we can provide feedback in enough time for, you know, that applicant to make modifications and still submit their application on time. So, Colette or Mary, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, sometimes we'll get a call for assistance, and it's just somebody has a quick question, like, you know, when are the EPA grant guidelines coming out? You know, we get that all the time. That's a quick piece of assistance we can give you, but sometimes, you know, our assistance, you know, goes on for a while. You know, I like to say that, you know, we will hold your hand for a while. So, you know, we might get you over one hurdle in identifying the funds. Once you get the funds, then your next hurdle is, okay, how do I do this? You know, what do I do next? So we'll get you over that hurdle. So we can stay with you throughout the entire redevelopment process. The other thing I want to mention is a lot of communities will call us and they don't know what they're asking us. You know, they don't know what the assistance is that they need, and that's fine. You don't have to call us and say, okay, I need this, this, and this. Call us and say, here's the situation. You know, we have brownfields in our town, not sure what to do, or we have the money, not sure how to use it, or, you know, whatever your situation is, we'll we'll talk to you for a while. We'll ask you questions. You tell us about your community. You tell us about your challenges. And then through the course of that conversation, we'll list a bunch of ways that we can help you. And then it's up to you to decide how you want to interact with us, how you want to use our assistance. So again, the first thing you do is call us or email us, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything. CClear is really backed up right now with the grant application reviews. Absolutely, that creates a bottleneck. But beyond that, we have a program called Vision to Action that CClear does for its select communities who really need longer term, broader based evaluation and handholding through the planning and redevelopment process. Or it can be, as Colette said, a quick phone call. Each of the TAB providers, NJIT, KSU, and CClear, have other what we call TAB partners. And so there's access to a lot of different technical specialties that they can access through those partners. All of it paid for by EPA. It's all free to the people who use it. So if you need someone to help with a real estate market study, or you need help with reviewing a phase 1 or phase 2 report that you got from your consultant and you don't know how to interpret it, if you need some guidance on selecting an environmental consultant or working with a developer, or I've participated in one call that came through with a municipality that was wanting to learn how to work with environmental insurance and hadn't ever done that before. So it's a very broad net of ways we can help. And as Colette said, pick up the phone.
Yeah, and let me just add to that, at NJIT, our core staff are planners, engineers, environmental scientists, and social scientists. And, so we're not just focused on the contamination issue. Actually, probably most of what we all do has nothing to do with the contamination, although we can guide you through that. It's really, a lot of it is about community planning, community revitalization, community engagement, navigating the regulatory process. So, we, as Mary said, we have partners outside of our core staff, but at least I can't speak for the others, but at NJIT, our core staff is really multidimensional. And, we'll look at a problem from all different angles. So again, call us, email us, we're here to help.
Yeah, that's the key. Just getting that initial conversation started. Okay, we have a couple more questions. And this one, Colette, I think I'll pose to you first, and then Mary, you probably have some insight to this one as well. What impact do you think the pandemic and economic shock will have on the future of brownfields?
Oh,
loaded question, I know.
Yeah, how much time do we have here? I think, the thing we're seeing a lot this pandemic has caused is how do you engage your community if you can't meet with them in person? So there's that whole community engagement aspect of redevelopment. As far as brownfields themselves, I think we may be seeing more if the way we work and where we work changes. We're all working remotely, and is that going to change where the workforce works from? Is that going to leave empty buildings and empty sites that now become more brownfields? We have that, that's an issue. Another issue is, COVID is really hitting municipalities, local government staffs hard. Local government staffs are focused on the pandemic and response to it. There's also, funding issues or a lack of funding, going to local governments. So they may not have the ability to focus on their brownfields like they have in the past or like they want to. So those are some of the things that we're seeing. I don't know, Mary, if you want to jump in. there's anything else.
Well, from my perspective, and your points are very well taken, Colette. From my perspective, brownfields are real estate, and what you're looking at is redevelopment, revitalization of a piece of real estate. I think that analysis has changed with COVID. There are certainly whole market sectors that are taken off the table in terms of highest and best use or economically feasible reuse of a particular property. I wouldn't want to be someplace trying to build a hotel or an office building or a mall right now. So our reuse scenarios have shifted. Industrial, both light and heavy industrial, are actually very strong right now in the market. So a lot of places that we might have once upon a time looked at more for office or for retail are now we're looking at for industrial reuse. The other sector that's very strong is housing. A number of sites we're looking at now, we are again taking something that might have been a light industrial or retail, and we're looking at it for housing of various market rate and affordable or mixed use. So I think that it's none of us have a crystal ball. I think the uncertainties are here to stay. I think some of the shifts in the way we work and the way we shop and the way we live are going to persist. And so I think some of our development is going to reflect that. There will be a need for more warehouse distribution space. We're seeing it already, and I don't think that's going to go away. Port activity is at almost record high. And the other factor is how common spaces get designed is changing as well. And so the mix of use of a space in a property that's redeveloped is changing also. So those are the impacts that I see on a daily basis.
Thank you. I don't really have anything to add. I would agree with all of that. Then this question is for Colette. If you know, for the sites that you gave examples on, do you know what the remediation costs were for those sites? The participant asking the question is saying that they have a site in their region that's estimated to cost about $20 million for remediation, and they're just wondering if that's on the high end or more of an average for these larger sites.
So the remediation costs for the examples that I gave varies tremendously. Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but the sites that I used for the case studies vary. They vary in size. They vary in the type of contamination that was there. They vary in how that contamination was remediated. So really can't give you much of a range there. As far as if that's high, the amount that you gave, I guess it really depends on what your reuse is and what the market will bear. I don't know, Mary, you have anything to?
So we look at sites with remediation costs from $50,000 to $50 million and up. So it can be all over the board. What I think is the more two metrics you might want to think about in considering your remediation costs, and I will say 20 million is probably on the higher end of what we usually see in brownfield redevelopment sites, but it's not out of the ballpark at all. What you really want to think about is what that equates to on a dollar per square foot basis, and how it compares to the underlying land value, because that's going to basically tell you how upside down your property is. So a $20 million remediation cost on a very high value property, on a very large high value property, is probably fine. If you have a $20 million remediation cost on a 1 acre site that's outside of town and really doesn't have a lot of inherent real estate value, then you have a problem. And then you have a very upside down deal, and you have to get extremely creative on how to find the funding to clean it up. So one of the things we look at in brownfield deals is really being able to recapture the inherent underlying real estate value in a property that is impaired in order to cover the cost of its remediation and bringing it back up to market value and bringing it back up to a reused, revitalized site. And very site specific. But those are a couple of thoughts, is take a look at it on a per square foot basis and take a look at it as compared to the underlying real estate value.
Great, thank you, ladies. We do not have any more questions that have come through. We do still have a few more minutes left, so I would say, Colette or Mary, do you have any other final parting comments that you would like to share?
You know, I was just thinking, you know, Mary used the term, you know, upside down to talk about real estate and finances. NJIT just, we're almost done, but we sponsored a webinar series for the New England area called Roadmap to Mill Redevelopment. And we've had a lot of different speakers, but one of the speakers was a developer, and he was talking about remediating these old mill sites and redeveloping them. And he made that point as well, that some of these sites, you know, on paper, you know, the finances and you know, the numbers are rough, but they're worth it. You know, in his opinion, it was worth redeveloping, reusing those mill sites because of the value back to the community. So if anybody's interested in that webinar series, we've recorded it and it's on the NJIT website. But that's what I was just thinking of when Mary used that term.
That's a good point, Colette. And one of the TAB partners for KSU TAB, Maggie, you know, Jesse Silverstein and his company, one of the things Jesse often talks about is, you know, as real estate developers and investors, we always look at return on investment. But for a municipality or a nonprofit, the return on investment isn't just a dollar for dollar. It's really a social or economic value stimulus return on that investment. And so it's a slightly different metric that might get applied to sites that are important to the community in various ways, whether it's posing, you know, a health threat to the surrounding neighborhood, if it's in an EJ community, if it's simply blight that the community wants to do something more vibrant with. There is the upside down feature of it, which is to say that the cost to remediate and redevelop the site is greater than what that property will be worth when it is done getting cleaned up and redeveloped. And so there is no return on investment, there is no profit in it for a private developer, and yet there may be a return on investment for the community, for a municipality, for a nonprofit, because there are other ways to value return. And it, you know, a private investor is going to be looking at it as cash on cash or IRR or some very cut and dried financial return. But for a community, it can be very different. It can be returning a heart and soul of a community in a particular site that has historic value, or it can be creating opportunity for jobs or recreation. So there's a lot of factors to consider in you know, whether something is worth the investment if the financial returns are slim.
And Mary, would you agree that, you know, in those cases that public-private partnership is really important? If the municipality can get, for instance, the EPA funding to deal with the, you know, site investigation and the cleanup, that's going to lower the risk for a developer to get involved.
Absolutely. That's so important, Colette. The whole concept of public-private partnerships is critical in many, many brownfield sites. And it's important to understand the reuse of a property before you head off to clean it up. There's so many points of intersection between the reuse plan and the cleanup plan, where those two things really need to be coordinated. So having a developer on the team early is important. The two things that I have communities asking about in the TAB program most often are, how do I find a developer? And once I find them, how do I work with them? And where do I find the money to make this site happen? Those are the two issues that I think are almost universally problems or concerns or challenges for municipalities across the country. And so those are both things that TAB can help with. Again, pitching TAB. But you know, having the developer at the table as you're going through that planning process and doing it as a public-private partnership it's the best way to go by far.
Great. Well, thank you guys for those final comments. I think that is an excellent way to end our session for today. And not only does it conclude our session, but it actually concludes the conference for today. As Mary, Colette, and I even mentioned, if you're interested or want to know more about the TAB program or what we've talked about today, please contact us. This webinar was recorded. The slides will be available, so you will have all of our contact information. And then just a quick reminder for conference attendees, we'll get started again tomorrow morning at 11 Eastern for the plenary session on justice, equity, and diversity. Thank you all for your participation and have a great evening or afternoon.
Bye all, thank you.